we really do need to pay more attention to how these chemicals work because they can modify how our hormones work and speak and signal around the human body for growth and development, insulin production and usage, fertility, brain development in utero, because it's not just enough from my research and what's out there to just remove these triggers or remove these chemicals. You have to add things into the human body, into the human existence that has been part of our lives for millions of years.
What's one product that's in most homes that you refuse to use and why? Dr. Aly Cohen is a triple board certified physician in rheumatology, internal medicine, and integrative medicine, and one of the country's leading medical and legal experts in environmental health. In addition to lecturing on environmental health at universities, medical schools, and physician training programs, she's on the faculty of the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine, Southern California University of Health Sciences, and the University of California, Irvine. As a triple board certified physician, why are you so passionate about teaching people about toxins related to human health?
Because what we now know is when we make better choices, when we change certain aspects of our lifestyle that affect our DNA and all of the choices affect our health, our gut microbiome, we change the destiny of our health. And that is a fact. We now know this. And so I'm here to share with people what they can do to change their health outcomes just through some very simple information.
So what are some of the things that, and again, this is going to blow a lot of people's mind.
Yeah.
If people are wondering why rates of certain chronic diseases have skyrocketed in recent years, you're going to get a huge illumination today. And I'm so grateful for this. But what are some of the issues that toxin exposure, again, something that is really, for many people, they don't even realize this is happening. We're just kind of swimming in this stuff. What are some of the health issues that this could be causing for people that they're not aware of?
Yeah. So what we're seeing, at least as I'm a rheumatologist, so I've been dealing with the immune system, and autoimmune diseases, immune disorders for 22 years. And what I'm seeing in the office, what I'm seeing on the ground floor is what's going on epidemiologically around the world, which is an epidemic of autoimmune and immune disorders. Just a couple numbers here. We have about 80 diagnosable Western classified autoimmune diseases. And that is likely to change over time, but essentially 80. And we now have between 7 and 14% of the US population that has at least one autoimmune disorder. The number is expected to rise, and 1% of the world population has rheumatoid arthritis. So it's not really because we're getting better at diagnosing, which is always sort of an argument, right? When you have 15 minutes with your doctor in a current healthcare system, it's not really that easy to make diagnoses. It's not easy to get a history that really contributes to your story and then what you can intervene with. So I think we have to take it for what it is, that we are now correlating this epidemic rise in chronic health diseases, chronic health issues, but also correlates with this enormous rise in our environmental chemicals that are harmful, that have been going on for a while, and that are unregulated and not really tested for health and safety. So that's really where we're at in modern day time. All
right. So again, rates of, and it's just not, better testing is not the only reason why, but rates of autoimmune issues have gone up precipitously in recent decades.
For sure.
And also the types.
Yeah.
The prevalence, the types.
And the age groups. So we're seeing even younger people experiencing some of these autoimmune diseases that you might not expect at younger ages. And what's so interesting also is that we're seeing these patients de novo without any family history. So a lot of people say, oh, cousin Susie had lupus, or Bob had this and my cousin had that. Maybe that's contributing. For sure, there's a genetic predisposition. But what we're seeing mostly is de novo cases of rheumatoid, lupus, MS, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, psoriatic arthritis with no family history that would make you have that argument or really think that it's strictly just a genetic component.
Yeah. You mentioned DNA earlier and just understanding and going back to, high school, biology, college, DNA to RNA to protein.
Yeah.
And understanding that what's getting printed out of us, the cells are getting printed out, are being influenced by these epigenetic controllers above all of that, right? So our genes have the blueprint, right? So we have these genetic factors, but these epigenetic exposures, and specifically ones that humans have never been exposed to before, ever in our history. And now we have not one, not 100, not 1,000, but thousands of newly invented chemicals. Can you talk about the current landscape with our chemical exposure?
So your point was really well taken there. So we have a genetic template, but the proteins that really sit on top of our genes that either allow or don't allow gene expression, that is modifiable by your lifestyle. And that includes sleep and stress reduction and getting, stopping smoking and exercise and all of those things. But it also includes environmental chemicals that we're now all exposed to in pretty much every aspect of our lives. And so really, if you want to think about controlling your future health and how that's going to roll out, not just for your own body, but even successive generations, you really want to be thinking about how you can intervene. And the area of environmental health and chemicals that we're talking about is one really powerful area where we can intervene to change that epigenetic expression or the DNA expression, because we know that that's something that's a part of there's several mechanisms, but definitely part of the potential mechanisms of how these, autoimmune diseases are becoming so prevalent.
Mm. So what are we dealing with? How many chemicals are we talking about here? We have
look, the number keeps growing. Since World War II, around the 1940s and 50s is when it really shot up, right? We had rayon and naugahyde and formaldehyde and, formica and pesticides and things that we used during wartime. We had chemicals that exploded to, work on crops and pesticides for food overseas. We had, pesticides to prevent the soldiers from getting infectious diseases. So a lot happened over wartime. The problem is we now have such an unlimited amount. It's pretty much 95,000 is about the working number, but people estimate more. And those are chemicals that are created for, again, all sorts of functions, uses, coloring for food and food additives. There's about 12,000 of those. We have chemicals that are used in solvents and building materials. So there's such a plethora. We have pretty much around 15 to 20 new polymers that are patented every week. We have over 1,000 new compounds that come to market every year. And something like bisphenol A or BPA has somewhere between 45 billion pounds per year come in and out, basically exported and brought into the United States for all the products that are being used with BPA and bisphenol. So, it's something that's not going to go away anytime soon. There's no regulation at this point or in the past to really make manufacturers test these ingredients, these chemicals before they go into the products that we use and we love. And so it's really kind of up to us to do the work. But it's not a lot of work, but it's being thoughtful about the work.
Yeah. One of the things that I really resonated with in studying you and your work was that this is not a, run for your life type of scenario. We're all kind of existing here in this glorified snow globe, and we're all exposed to a lot of things, but the human body is resilient. Yeah. And also there are simple, smarter choices that we can make to reduce our toxin exposure. And we're going to talk about that, of course. But what I really want to do is, because there's so many people that are experiencing health issues and they are struggling and they want to feel better and they're just looking for answers. And they've tried this thing, tried that thing, and they have no idea that, a certain conglomeration of chemicals that maybe it's, again, making its way into their home via some products that they're buying. Maybe it's in their water. I want to illuminate, you mentioned autoimmunity. What are some of the other conditions that could be impacted by people's toxin exposure?
I talk about cases in the book that I think will resonate with a lot of readers, because that was the point, is talking about my patients and what we've done to help fix their health issues. But it can be as vague or as, varied as fatigue or as abdominal pain or as rashes. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of things that don't necessarily constitute as a formal diagnosis of a disease, but they have symptoms that are making their lives uncomfortable or not living to their full potential, whether it's energy-wise or it's, GI function or have you. There's a variety of things. But But what I think is interesting is that in order to deduce from this very big topic, and it is a very big topic, navigating environmental health and these kind of chemical exposures really kind of requires a paradigm. And I had to come up with a paradigm because I teach physicians that are looking for this information, 3 programs now that did not get this information, by the way, in medical school, and high school and college students. And so the paradigm that I came up with, which was trying to really help people wrap their head around the topic, is the 4 A's. And so the 4 A's really starts with assess. You need to know what you're in. You need to know what you're exposed to. We have a 50-question survey with, numbers where you can actually add up, kind of where you're starting from on this journey. So assessing is really basic and important. The second A is avoid or swap. So knowing what you're exposed to, you can make decisions whether or not you need 20 different cleaners for your kitchen, a kitchen sink cleaner, a carpet cleaner, a surface cleaner, a window cleaner. I mean, a lot of that's marketing. A lot of that is not necessary and can really reduce your exposures by just lowering the numbers. And a swap for people who really just want to find something they like in a safer form. The third A is add, because it's not just enough from my research and what's out there to just remove these triggers or remove these chemicals. You have to add things into the human body, into the human existence that has been part of our lives for millions of years, like exercise and sweating, like proper sleep to clean our brains, via the lymphatic system, which is the fluid around our brains and our spinal cord. And while we sleep, we're doing a pretty good job of washing out some of the most harmful chemicals while we sleep. And things like clean drinking water, good quality food, and understanding the quality matters over often the macros of food. And we can talk about that. So adding in chemical, behaviors and nutrition. There's nutrients that we now know offset some of that DNA methylation and histone changes from the epigenetic changes we're seeing from exposures. And the last A, which I think is really quite important, and maybe my excuse, is allow. We have to allow. Life is a journey. Life is fluid. I color my hair. My boys play lacrosse on pretty toxic sports turf, many days a week. It's the birthday parties. It's eating the cake. It's traveling. I think if you don't have that 4th A, the allow, it doesn't allow people to just kind of start the journey and keep with it. So that was the paradigm. And I think that may be helpful to your audience.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Especially, again, that last A really is what resonated with me, because a lot of people are getting the feeling like everything's toxic, everything's wrong, I can't eat anything. And before you know it, we've got, like, if you are really trying to abide by everything, you're the boy in the plastic bubble. Did you see that movie, John Travolta?
Oh, yeah. I'm old enough to know about that. You just aged me. But yeah, look, I went through a 15-year journey since I began this process, with, very sad story in the beginning, and how I got into this was my dog got sick, and I had to kind of explore how he got sick at such a young age with an autoimmune disease. And I was really 15 years ago at that time, I didn't know anything about environmental chemicals. I just was heartbroken. Yeah. And so I started to explore, what could have made this dog sick, this golden retriever.
4 years old.
He was like
Truxton,
4 or 4.5, Sir Commodore Truxton. And, when I looked at his dog food and his water quality and the red toy that was made of vinyl that he sucked on, it's a very popular dog toy, I was looking at, flea and tick collar chemicals. I looked at everything. That was actually, I didn't know it, but an environmental health survey that I was performing. And as my years went on, where I was trying to study, is this true? There's no regulation. Is this true? We have all of these thousands of chemicals grandfathered in without required testing from the 70s and even beyond. As I layered those in and questioned and read the material and understood, the science, it really kind of, I was at first on the ledge, freaked out, so to speak. And I've since come down to earth, where I feel like we should all be able to do this as, with least amount of stress that we can do it with. But it's a journey for everybody. It's just, I want to make it a journey that people have material beyond waiting 15 years to learn it themselves. But it's an area where you can freak out, and from health coaching, that creates resistance. or that you could just kind of take a deep breath and say, I'm going to jump into this in a way that's reasonable and practical.
Yeah. Reading the story and it was very emotional just even reading it.
Yeah.
And you have a picture
I know.
as well.
I know.
So, oh my gosh, such a beautiful, like you could see the spirit and, you sometimes the most challenging things that we go through are creating and opening doors and capacities that we don't even know are there. And without that experience, you wouldn't be here illuminating and helping so many people to solve health issues that they don't even know are going on. And one of the things that jumped right out to me, you were mentioning is there's a red toy. Yeah. And you were looking at everything, dog food, everything.
Yeah, everything.
But that red toy, obviously the FDA has recently banned red dye, which is used in a ton of different products. And if we think about, okay, because Truxton was dealing with, in particular, was a liver impact. And the liver is dealing with so much of the toxicity in our world. It is responsible for metabolism of toxins. It's like its main job, right?
Yeah.
And it just reminded me to look at this and all the different things that it can impact, because this was even dating back to 1997, by the way. 1997, this study I'm going to share. So this was published in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives. The title of the study was Estrogenic and DNA Damaging Activity of Red Number 3 in Human Breast Cancer Cells, by the way, because why it was taking so long to ban it it's harmful in animal studies. It's causing cancer in animals, right? And so this was back in 1997. But one of the things that that you just brought up, and also I wanted to reiterate, there's thousands of these dyes, right? It's just like they're just checking off one. And let me share this with you really quickly, because for me, it's like, that's red dye number 3. What happened number 1? What happened to 2? Red number 1 was banned in 1961 after it was discovered that it caused liver cancer. Red dye number 2 was banned by the FDA in 1976 after it was linked to cancer. Red dye number 4 banned by the FDA in 76 because high levels, and this is what I want to ask you about, high levels of the dye was found to, quote, damage adrenal cortex in animals. So when you hear something like this, it's just like, oh, it's a little bit of dye maybe in a toy, but it's this concept of the dose makes the poison, right? Is that always the case?
No, great question. And so, and when you're talking about the red dye, it's funny you say that, because in addition to what you're finding about, say, a toy that has, and by the way, these are animals that have no testing for their products at all, let alone the dyes that humans at least have some early studies, as you're pointing to. It was the vinyl chloride, the sort of the polyvinyl chloride plastic, that when I researched this back in the day for this dog, and we all have access to PubMed.gov, which is basically the way to find journal articles like you did, medical journal articles, right? And when I looked at that, it turned out that there was a history of autoimmune liver cancer and autoimmune liver diseases amongst workers that worked in polyvinyl chloride plants that make these chemicals, that use these chemicals. And so it really made me focus, look, again, life is about lots of different inputs, could have been some of his water, could have been some of his food issues. But when you think about someone, a dog having a toy in their mucous membranes, which is so absorbent. I say this about literally young women and vaginal canal. The tissue of that area is why we use drugs, estradiol, in those areas, right? Because they absorb really quickly. But so too does it also absorb chemicals that we're exposed to, especially synthetic compounds. And so, when I think about this dog, as I described, having this toy in his mouth round the clock for 4.5 years of his life, even while he slept, you start to think about whether or not that exposure, let alone the dye, it's the plastics as well. So it elicits something, where we're full of mixtures of chemicals. Yeah. We're getting those chemicals not just from number one chemical or two. We're getting thousands of chemicals in our bodies. The goal is to say, let's not test for all of them. Because at any given moment, for instance, you can have any number that either break down shortly or have a longer half-life, some that you're not exposed to because you went out of town or what have you. The goal is to just really be conscious of what your regular habits are, what your regular inputs are in terms of food quality, water quality, and work on those issues as much as you can. Because again, it's a big topic. We're exposed. We just have to think about what's a really practical way to hit this issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you are talking about, and there's different names for this, but it's an entourage effect.
Yeah.
It's
or mixtures.
all of the
They
things.
call them mixture studies. And it's this idea, and you could argue also with medications. I mean, when you're taking one medication,
Polypharmacy,
polypharmacy, when you're studying one medication or and the FDA does an approval, it's not looking at a human body being exposed to what most people are using, which is probably multiple chemicals in any given time, especially as you're getting older, there's a much higher rate of polypharmacy. But then you add some of the chemicals that have their own known chemistry.
Right.
That's where you're starting to get sort of a mixture, a soup of chemistry in your body. It's a tricky thing. Humans are hard to study. Animals are much easier to study because you can control some of these exposures by far. You can even manipulate genes to make them either predisposed to developing an autoimmune disease and test chemicals to see how that works. So there's lots we can do in labs that I think is really important when it comes to messaging, like the work I do, because we don't always have hard and fast evidence-based science for direct connections between a chemical and a human health issue. What we know is we put it all together and we use what's called the precautionary principle to think about all the evidence that exists in those studies on mice or occupational studies. The Chamaco study in California is looking at migrant farmers, and their families and how their bodies are responding to being exposed to pesticides. So you put all that together, you make smart decisions, and that's kind of really how things work, really, for humans.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of these compounds are not tested, right? So we've got thousands that are not tested.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about how that's possible, number one, and also you mentioned that these studies are not showing how these things are affecting us, in particular with humans, but let alone animals in combination. So most studies that are done, the few that are, again, the percentage wise, they're done in isolation, right? So looking at an isolated chemical and its effects and not how it's working with all these other different chemicals.
Right.
And so how is it possible that thousands of newly invented chemicals that are affecting human health without a doubt are just legal to put out here in the atmosphere?
Well, it turns out when you don't start off with great legislation in the 1930s and the 1950s, it's very hard to implement manufacturing to be required to do the testing that we now know they should do. It's like putting the genie back in the bottle. So, for instance, in the food system, the 1958 Food Additives Amendment was really supposed to rein in some of the health, the testing that was needed to be, the testing that was required to ensure that these food additives, whether it's for taste or for preservatives or for colors or for crunch or any other things that are added, whether they were safe before putting into food products. And it's failed tremendously because they basically harness what's called the generally recognized as safe designation, which allowed manufacturers to just hand in whatever any research they did, if they did any at all, and say, okay, we think this is good enough. We think this is safe. So this GRAS, or generally recognized as safe designation, has gotten us into a lot of problems because it's allowed thousands of chemicals to enter the food system, and in food packaging, mind you.
Right.
This has been the problem for a long time. In 1976, there was something called TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, which made an attempt to rein these chemicals in, but it failed. And so we've really, and they tried to reopen this discussion in 2016. So we've had a long history of failure when it comes to requiring these chemicals, to really be tested for health effects. And you mentioned, the dose makes the poison. I wanted to say a little bit about how many of the chemicals we're discussing have thrown science on its head. Classical toxicology, which is dose makes the poison, which is from Paracelsus in the 1500s. Essentially, what we'd think of is the more the exposure, the more the physiologic change, for good or bad, right? The higher, I look at it like, you go drinking and you get sick, the more alcohol you drink, right? So the dose makes the poison. You get sick from something that you're adding into your system. Well, it turns out that many of the chemicals that were identified as problematic to human health are following something called non-monotonic dose response, which essentially means that we are now able to figure out at very, very, very tiny doses, like parts per million, parts per billion, and parts per trillion, tiny, tiny amounts, similar to hormones and the way they work in the human body, that these chemicals can do similar things. They can mimic how hormones work, which is you only need a teeny tiny amount to do very big physiologic activity. And that kind of, instead of like a linear curve, it looks like a U or an upside down U, meaning, the dose really at low doses can have huge effects, which no one bothered to test it before because they were going for the high dose exposures. When that occurred in science, it really flipped the science world on its head. It showed us that we really do need to pay more attention to how these chemicals work because they can modify how our hormones work and speak and signal around the human body for growth and development, insulin production and usage, fertility, brain development in utero, male and female genitalia in utero. So there was a lot that we now discovered that had to be kind of relearned, unlearned, and relearned. And then from an immune system perspective, which is what I'm trying to also focus on, and calling these chemicals immune disrupting chemicals, not just endocrine disrupting chemicals or EDCs, we can see that they also have immune system effects and that systems talk to each other. There's lots of crosstalk between our immune system and our endocrine system. So long story short, we know to focus now on, I say we, researchers, not manufacturers, who are doing this beautiful work on seeing how low doses affect human health and really giving pause to our exposures and where we can cut them off, really.
Yeah. This is, all right, at this point, it should be Captain Obvious that there's this crosstalk. It's all existing in one human entity.
Sure.
But you're, and you know this better than most, triple board certified physician, our education is largely compartmentalized, right? So much is separating the body into these different specialties. And not understanding truly when you're looking at your patient, everything is working together.
For sure.
Right? And so talking about these exposures impacting in particular what's happening with our immune system and what's happening with our endocrine system, these two amazing systems and super intelligent systems are impacting every aspect of our health, right?
Correct.
And so with this being said, this is why we know and why your work is affirming this, that this isn't just an issue of, having some allergies, for example, or, some small autoimmune conditions. We're talking about some severe issues that can arise, cancers. And if we just look at the results going on, and I'm a big fan of just like, look at what's happening.
Yeah, sit back and perspective on this big picture issue. Yeah.
Cancer has gone up precipitously, certain types of cancers in particular.
Younger ages.
And younger
with
younger
no
populations.
Family history.
Right? And also obesity as well has skyrocketed. And we, again, attribute that to one very vanilla thing, right? People are eating more and moving less.
Right.
And now we know we have this wonderful category, this label that we put on them as obesogens.
Correct.
Some of these chemicals that are obesity-causing agents that are epicaloric, right? They are above the calorie control and influencing how our body is managing fat storage.
Fat storage, and also how stem cells that come from our bone marrow, what they turn into, whether they turn into platelets or red blood cells, they actually turn into adipocytes. So, and BPA, for example, was another chemical that, one of the first endocrine disrupting chemicals, by the way, that's so well studied that has both endocrine and immune system effects. BPA was found to turn off what's called adiponectin, which changes how fat cells are developing. So, no doubt about it. There are now properties amongst many of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that really do help, keep us fat or, in many ways make us fat. So it's not just about how many calories in, calories out, as you know, and we're missing a big piece of the chemistry that's going on in our bodies, even at the cellular level, that we can really make a dent in. We can really help to curve how these processes go. But you're absolutely right. How we categorize them is often many of these chemicals by what function, what harm they cause, right? Neurotoxins, liver toxins, obesogens. They're also categorized by their own function. Are they stain-proof chemicals? Are they non-stick chemicals? Are they waterproofing chemicals? Are they solvents? Are they emulsifiers? So I think because it's such a big topic, I like to break it down into things that affect our are walking through life. What do we put on our body? What do we put in our body? What is drinking water, food, personal care, all of those, air quality, all those are tangible for the average person, right? Including myself. Those are tangible. And that's a good place to start, is working through those areas as opposed to becoming a toxicologist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to ask you a specific question about what you do, which I'm going to do that in just a moment. But just to lean into this point one more time, and something that you brought up. So again, with the chemistry of some of these new compounds, fat cells, they could be lipophilic, right? And so just attracted and taking up shop in our fat cells. And we're going to talk about some things we could do to detoxify as well. But also you mentioned fertility, because when I think of body fat, like this is all in that equation with fertility, with fertility and with growth and development as well. Yeah. So what's going on with, for example, growth and development of our kids? Is this toxin exposure in the modern life affecting things like the maturing of our kids and growth and development?
Well, yeah. So we're now seeing that, there are certain, periods of human development that are very vulnerable. Let's start with that, right? And most of us would pick, okay, pregnancy, right? That's a vulnerable period for a fetus, right? We think about, fetal alcohol syndrome and anything that you can think of, smoking during pregnancy. But we should probably consider very strongly about also environmental chemicals. And it's never to blame moms. I'm never going to do that because, look, I had 2 kids and didn't know a darn thing about any of this stuff. So I think when you know better, you do better. But the idea is that, and spouses and partners can certainly participate, not even if they're carrying a fetus, but those periods that are very vulnerable to environmental exposures and also to development. So you have the in utero fetal development. You have children that are young. They don't have yet developed their detoxification systems. Their livers don't work at the level of an adult. They also have very narrow diets, which are really important to that AD paradigm, where your nutrients can offset these exposures, but they're not eating broccoli and kale. They're eating, chopped up baby food and maybe breast milk. So the idea is that those periods plus teenage years, I have 2 teenage boys, lots of hormonal change, lots of ups and downs, right? That's a window where some of these exposures could have greater harm. And the argument is, and I did a TED Talk on this because I researched high school students, and I wanted to know what do they want this information? What do they know about environmental health? By the way, teenagers use the most personal care products per 24-hour period than any other demographic. So when you have this, vulnerable period of development, lots of flux of hormones, that we all are aware of, and then you have these potential influx of a lot of chemicals that don't compare to even adults or, to men and women who use, products. That's potentially where you can see some additional changes for their fertility risk, for their cancer risk, for things down the line. Menopause too. We don't think much about menopause in terms of a flux of hormones other than just kind of losing estrogen. But in fact, that change period is also considered another vulnerable period of human development. And so overall, we don't want to be exposed, period, right? Who are we kidding, right? Any period of life. But those particular stages are considered more vulnerable. And I think it needs, we need to be training OB-GYNs and obstetrician gynecologists and healthcare providers. We need to be giving them an idea of how important this conversation is for people who want to have kids potentially in their future. But we also want to be thinking about going direct to young people. One of the areas that I'm always interested in and what I hope to get into more in terms of, education is getting a curriculum into high schools nationally that helps young people navigate how to look up their makeup and personal care products. I make my kids do it, and I do it with my students. Very easy with very simple apps, but also they are going to formulate their behaviors for the rest of their lives. It's a great time to get those changes in and have them be able to work through that those choices. And they may have kids one day. So you're setting them up for success in a different way than academics and other things. You're setting them up for health, optimization, really. And it starts young.
Yeah. And so is this something that we can definitively say? We know that puberty is happening younger.
For sure. And it's a great point you're making. So that exactly is one of the ways we're seeing a change during those vulnerable periods. It used to be a couple hundred years ago that women, for instance, would start their period or menarche at, say, 16 years of age. We're seeing it now starting in young girls as early as 8 and 9 years old. Boys, too, have shifted their puberty earlier as well. And it's really believed to be largely in part due to the chemicals that are in products that they are particularly, anxious to use. Also diet in terms of, processed foods and those chemicals. And they can mimic growth hormone. They can disrupt normal physiology, and they mimic androgens, or they can block androgens, and they can also mimic estrogens, like estrogen itself. Also, thyroid conditions, very rampant and
Yes.
kind of almost epidemic, really, in young people and teenagers, because in that situation, it's not just environmental chemicals that have a strong affinity for thyroid gland, but it's lack of iodine, it's lack of a nutritional component that has been part of our human existence for millions of years that we're just not getting enough of. So I look at this conversation of iodine as a really specific but interesting example of what we're doing. We're having chemicals that attach to the thyroid. We have lack of protection from nutrition. And that causes disruption and potentially health issues, but we can reverse all of that. We can reverse all of that by being conscious of nutrition and getting rid of those chemicals and really changing thyroid health.
Yeah. What's one product that's in most homes that you refuse to use, and why?
Air freshener, candles, incense, things that are unregulated. Lots of phthalates are essentially the main, or one of the main chemical groups that are used to make fragrance last longer. And it's just so easy to fix. It's, I remember the day, I even wrote about it in the book. I remember the day that I took an entire drawer of plug-in air fresheners. They were like Ocean Breeze and, Sunset Hills and, pumpkin spice and things for the holidays. And I remember taking the entire drawer, which had made me so happy, right? And I just dumped it all once I really knew, the chemicals that hide within fragrance and perfume. And that goes with cleaning products too. There's so many ways to just simply be aware and choose better. So I think that's probably the easiest is, not bringing these products into your home where they reside and end up being testable in blood and urine and in your body. So
Right.
it just makes a lot of sense to cut off that line of exposure.
Yeah. And this is factual. This is just a big wake up call for us that, we're interacting with these things, and it's literally showing up in our urine, in our blood.
Correct.
And so if you're breathing something, it's literally in your body.
Like oxygen, right? You breathe oxygen, it's in your system. Well, anything that air carries, including, PM or particulate matter 2.5, which is really particles in the air that you can't see. And that includes chemicals, but it includes smoking chemicals or vaping chemicals. It includes ozone. It includes things that you can't always control. What I ask people to think about is look at what you can control. Look at your home. Look at where you create a home and a nest where you have, ways to control water quality when it hits your home and you put it in your glass. What you buy for products in terms of your food, what you clean your home with, because those chemicals will aerate into the air, but they'll also land on surfaces and make their way into dust, which has been very well studied as one of the biggest collections of household chemicals that are harmful to the human body is in dust. And who's on the floor, by the way? Kids, hand-mouth behavior, pets, licking their paws. So thinking about how to just cut off the input, I think is really important. And, just like I said, choosing better, and slowly but surely, it's a process, but slowly or surely you get better and better at it. It's like gamifying. You can get better and better at it.
Yeah. And this book truly, and we were talking about this before the show, this is that statement, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. You have the guide on this subject matter in this book form that's never been shared before, and coming from somebody with such esteem and who's been in this field and studying this stuff and really has truly definitive answers. Like this is not a question anymore. This is harming us. And so what are some of those big players? You're pointing those things out for us so we become aware. but also talking about what to add in and what we can do to detoxify. And so that's what I want to talk about now, because the truth is, all of us, everybody listening, we've got a lot of these newly invented compounds that are making their way in and on our bodies. And the human body is incredibly resilient, though. And there are certain things we can do to help our bodies to detoxify.
For sure.
So let's talk about some of those things.
Yeah. I mean, our bodies are amazing. I wouldn't have gone into medicine if I didn't think the body was pretty incredible. My dad's a doctor. I mean, it's just, I wanted to know physiology. And I think, also learning anthropology and evolution and how long we've been on the earth and what our bodies have needed for a very long time to thrive, all the way at the cellular level. Our bodies are made up of 85 to 90% water. So we really kind of can think about, well, if our bodies are made up of water, we run on water. Should we get that right? Should we really be thinking about that? Because if you're going to wash your body through and help it detoxify, you don't want to start with dirty water, right? So one of the most important things I talk about is getting your water source as best you can to be cleaned up. And that allows your kidneys, which is a detoxifying organ, your liver to get flushed with blood. With the water in your blood, that is going to help your liver actually do its job and break down many chemicals and to help eliminate them. But we also have skin, right? Our skin is a remarkably incredible organ. It's the largest in the body. And the skin is able to sweat out many of the chemicals. It's difficult because no one puts a lot of money into the studies that I think are so critical to studying sweat from a chemical perspective as much as I think they should. But we have a lot of information to show that sweating is critical to really getting rid of toxins, just like the kidneys and the liver. So thinking about what we put into our body, how we wash it through, thinking about the gut microbiome, which is an incredible amount of science that has, I'm sure you've talked about it before, 26 feet of bowel, and it's a gut tube, essentially. The interior lining is the microbiome. It's filled with microbes that have been with us a very long time. They respond to foods we eat, whether it's pesticide foods, they kill bugs in the field. Why wouldn't they knock off some good guys in the gut, right? So thinking about food quality for the gut and chlorinated drinking water, things that are in water, like I said. So I think when we think about detoxifying, a lot of people get into their mind that they have to do a cleanse. They have to do some kind of high colonic. They have to do, a lot of, I think, extreme things. My argument and what I talk about in the book is that we can harness our own physiology, our beautiful physiology, to really eliminate many of these chemicals. And I say that with patients that are in the book and how we worked through that. But anyone could really jump on board knowing how our body does such a great job of this.
Yeah. You mentioned the first thing you said was to get our water right. And it makes sense because, again, we're mostly water.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? Like, what are some of the things we should be doing when it comes to water?
So a whole chapter on water, because I talk also about bottled water and choices that we don't always have access to our home filter, that type of thing. But when I think about water, I think it's one of the most underestimated, underemphasized, contributor to human health that people are not thinking about. So many books on diet, macros and which diet to be on and that kind of thing. But no one really talks a lot about water quality aside from hydration. And I think if people were aware, and I'll share this with them now, that across the U.S., 85% of the U.S. population is served by what we call wastewater treatment plants. In other words, water in our environment goes through lakes and streams and aquifers or underneath the ground, mountaintops, all feed into wastewater treatment plants. And there's 160,000 of them in the U.S., across the U.S., that serves 85% of the U.S. population's drinking water. The other 15% is wells, either their own personal well at their home or their town well, a lot of rural areas. But under the Safe Drinking Water Act from 1974, okay, we're talking 50 years ago, there's one law that basically talks about how there's only 91 chemicals mandated to be measured and remediated or fixed if it goes too high in all of these 160,000 wastewater treatment plants. So in other words, we're living in a world now that we have thousands of chemicals that can get into our water, lakes, streams, sewage turns into drinking water. Talk about a shocker, right? And it goes through these plants, but it's only cleaned off of essentially to a certain level, 91 chemicals. And knowing that information and seeing some of the images that I've posted on social media of my water change out, filtration makes really good sense. It makes really good sense. And it's not to say that everyone has to have the top of the line, expensive whole house filtration. I actually discourage that because I want people to use their money wisely. But you can use any filter, which would be better than nothing, whether it's a pitcher, which is a carbon block, or a refrigerator door is a carbon block. It's like water runs through it pretty quickly, so it doesn't take as much off as it could. And then all the way up through something called reverse osmosis, which is a material that is so tightly woven, it catches everything that's bigger than even like a virus or a bacteria. So the idea is that you can choose whatever you want now, and that even the price point of reverse osmosis has come down so dramatically that they're like $275. And you can put one under your sink with a plumber for $150 doing it in 1 hour. And that's pretty easy because then you don't have to keep filling it up. But the idea is I talk through some of these ideas and options, and filtering your water, I think, is one of probably the easiest thing to do once you get through just making the decision. And it has so much, of the highest yield health effects in terms of detoxifying and just washing through our system for sure.
Yeah. Just start with anything.
Yeah, start with anything. There's nothing wrong.
Some kind of filter.
Exactly.
If you don't use a filter, you become the filter.
Yeah.
So
it's really true. You're putting you're exposing your body. And I think it's one of the most reasonable ways to start. And it certainly is, you walk through it very simply in the book.
Yeah. I love that. And again, this is a high leverage. And also water is going to help with detoxification. For sure. Right? Again, this is one of those things that's overlooked because it's not so complicated and harsh and but your body is constantly our bodies are intelligent. Your body's going to choose, when this clean, fresh water comes in, it ramps everything up. And this is why our metabolic rate changes when we drink water. It's not just from our bodies like warming the water up. It's because processes ramp up and your body can help to eliminate metabolic waste and just kind of clean house.
Absolutely. And RO water, but interesting fun fact, and I mentioned my dad's a doctor, he's a kidney specialist. In the 1970s, when dialysis was first really invented and brought to everyday people. I mean, we sort of forget I'm older, but I don't know how much older. But, the idea that we really never had kidney machines that helped people who had kidney failure it's pretty recent. It's only 50 years old, but they were mandated at the start of dialysis development to use reverse osmosis water. And the tanks are floor to ceiling. They're huge tanks. And they were only designed to use reverse osmosis in order to protect these patients who are immune compromised from viruses and bacteria and infection. Well, it turns out 50 years later, they're also able to catch all the bigger compounds that were developed later. And but those machines now have come down in such price points, as I mentioned, that it's like democratizing, clean water and clean food is a real issue. And we can do it now because of price points. Yeah,
that's so true. So true. It's changed a lot. There's a video of me, it's almost 20 years old on YouTube of me talking about this issue, and talking about water and also municipal water, which, the particulate matter, I was like talking about the toilet paper and, these different drugs that people are taking and they're pissing and pooping.
Finding it in water systems. And that's because they're not being, there's no infrastructure there's no regulation, no law, but there's actually no chemistry to do that in such big water systems, and so it's up to us, this is the issue. It's like you can wait for legislation to change, red dye number 3. Some of the perfluoralkyls have been added to 6 of them to a list to put on that 91 chemicals list, but there's 15,000 perfluoralkyls. We're just looking at 6 to add to the list. The idea is that we need to kind of do this for ourselves. You cannot wait for, to be saved or to other people to regulate. And that's one of the big turning points, I think, when people hear this topic. We kind of have to think about it for ourselves. We don't have to go nuts, but we want to start thinking about it.
That's what it's all about,
Yeah.
and be empowered and just
Right.
making smart decisions. And, again, with this water topic it's so important, and it's never been easier because, again, price points come down with RO systems. Also, there's a lot of access. It's super popular now with getting your water from, bottled in glass and things
Sure.
like that. So whatever fits your medium, but I want to encourage people, and also your work. I've seen you reiterate this point. We don't have to be neurotic.
No.
If you have some water that's in a plastic bottle every now and then, but what are you choosing to do most often?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will make a point about choosing plastic bottles because here I traveled to get out here and you don't always have access, of course, to filters. So even choosing plastic water bottles, you're not necessarily going to cut back on microplastics, right? We know that's a whole nother topic. But glass and stainless steel is a way to reduce those as well. But when you're choosing even plastic water bottles in between life and filtration, whatever, you can even look for the word ingredients on water bottles and it'll tell you how that water was cleaned. It's either going to be usually distilled, cleaned by distillation or cleaned by reverse osmosis. So choose reverse osmosis because that's the more aggressive way to clean water. And there's a choice that you can make now when you're traveling and you're on the go. It's having that power to make those choices that I think is really so great.
Now, you mentioned also sweating and how
Yeah.
that can be a powerful mechanism for removing toxins from our system. How we go about doing that? What are some best practices?
Well, certainly exercise is great for the brain. It's great for flow and mental health. So I'm a runner. I love to run. And I even actually talk about in the book how I add extra layers. I look kind of silly sometimes when I'm running, but I hydrate well and then I run and I kind of want to sweat more. I'm using that not just to feel good mentally, but also to, throw that sweat into my clothing. And that's one way to do it. And people, as a rheumatologist, people can get exercise even in chair aerobics, right? Even if your lower extremities, you have knee arthritis or hip arthritis, certainly many things you can do to sweat from just upper body movement. But sauna, I think old-fashioned sauna is what I prefer. If you have access to a gym with the sauna, if you create your own sauna, if you go to places in the world where they have natural saunas, take advantage of that because it's another mechanism of washing some of these chemicals out of your body. Those are some of the most important ways, I think. And it's interesting when you're sweating through even exercise, you're flushing the liver with blood flow. And there's actually studies showing that you're increasing what's called stage 2 conjugation, which is the breakdown of many of these environmental chemicals, these IDCs, EDCs. And so there's many mechanisms from running and from exercise that contribute to the whole process of lowering those exposures.
Yeah. So again, there's so many points of entry for this one, but it is super important. We have this capacity for a reason. Yeah. It's a really important aspect of detoxification for ourselves, no matter where you are. And you mentioned some great options, obviously exercise and put on some layers, but getting to a sauna if you can at a gym or if somebody has a sauna. I know people that have saunas at their home that never use them.
Yeah.
And also when I lived in Ferguson, Missouri, all right, just like didn't have really 2 nickels to rub together. And it was because of my mother-in-law and we were doing these different, detoxification strategies, but one of them was to sweat. And what we did, there's no gyms in Ferguson. There's no gyms, there's no yoga studios. And also this was dead of winter, and this is, again, it's safety. All right. In parentheses, safety, but basically boiling a pot of water and just sitting it on, something safe on the floor, throwing a blanket over your head and sweating from that, like there's so many different ways there. This is not about accessibility. This is about choice and being proactive. Once you find out about this, and this isn't something that you have to do all the time. Maybe if you could once a week get a good sweat in, even once a month, it's going to be super helpful for
there's
you.
No one's judging. I look at it as no one's judging. I look at it as a journey that no one's judging. Again, you have to appreciate the reason to do it. You need the why to do pretty much the what. It's almost like you need a reason if people, are about to have a baby. There's a tendency, very primal tendency to be thinking, even if no one ever told a woman that, like there is primal instincts. And there's, we didn't talk about food, which we can talk about. But, the idea is that, again, reiterating, you're taking away as many of the things that were letting into our body just by not even being aware, and now we're aware, or by just fewer choices, by fewer products, swapping out. But then we're adding in, like you said, sweating and exercise and sauna and sleep and all of these really important mechanisms. So the two together, the processes together, are where we're going to see the most benefit in terms of exposure. So
you've said the S word a couple times.
Yeah.
You said sleep.
Yep.
How does sleep relate to detoxification?
Yeah. So sleep is really quite important when it comes to just clearance of chemicals while you sleep from the brain. And, the studies really ramped up in 2013, 14, 15 from around the world. And they were studying the chemistry of cerebral spinal fluid, so the fluid around the brain and the spinal cord. And they were finding that when people slept overnight and the longer they slept, and not necessarily hitting all stages of sleep, but really the time spent where the brain is shut down as much as it can be, and there's time given to sleep because we all take sleep for granted. But that's time well spent in terms of clearing chemicals. And I even read some studies recently that even our breathing pattern while we sleep can either increase or decrease the rate of, excretion of a lot of these chemicals. So I think sleep is such an important, underrated topic. You talk a lot about sleep. I talk a lot about water. We should, we're combining our big efforts here. But sleep is really underrated in terms of a health, prescription, if you ask me.
Awesome. That's, again, something we don't think about. Like to detoxify our bodies, we need to prioritize our sleep. And that's the glymphatic system that you were talking about. And really just, it's approximately 10 times more active when you're sleeping, cleaning out metabolic waste, making room for new growth. It's important. Super
Even
simple
brain
stuff.
cell connections. I mean, thinking about how our brain rests and collects memories while we sleep, it's just a remarkable, and no mammals can live without it. I mean, it's just a remarkable.
We have not evolved out of this.
We have not evolved. Our bodies need to shut down. It's just one of the things that has to do with survival and living on. It's crazy.
Yeah. Let's talk about food. You mentioned earlier iodine in the context of thyroid health. So what are some things for us to do nutritionally? Because these are the compounds our bodies can't do any of this stuff.
Right.
These detoxification pathways aren't going to work unless they have the fuel to do it. And also food makes up all the parts. Your liver is made from food. Your skin is made from food.
Right.
Which foods can help us with detoxification?
So it's what's not in food first that I would think about in terms of chemicals. And then we'll talk about which foods we want to add in as inputs that really support our cells and our detox processes. So thinking about what we eat in terms of processed foods, most people can wrap their head around, lots of chemicals, lots of junk. But even fruits and vegetables, which may be a lift for people to think about, but I want them really to think about the quality in terms of exposure to pesticides in just fruits and vegetables and things we consider pretty healthy, right? That's great. I want whole foods, plant-based fiber is really great at, sponging up a lot of chemicals through our GI system, keeping us, our colons healthy so we have less colon cancer. For sure, we need more fiber. But thinking about the quality of produce. And one of the things, I always talk about USDA organic as being a really great choice if you have access to it. And I'm going to say that most people do now because USDA frozen produce is a big thing now. It's in every big box supermarket across the country. And I spend a lot of time, even in LA and running around different parts. Everywhere I go, I tend to go to a supermarket to see if they have a selection of USDA organic with the seal, produce, which is flash frozen, which has two very important components to it. Number one, you have, by being organic, USDA organic, which is the only regulation in the food system that actually has any teeth because it keeps thousands of pesticides out of the soil those are grown in and off of the spraying of those produce. Fertilizer chemicals are limited dramatically. It's not perfect system, but it's really quite good. Genetically modified ingredients are not allowed in organic foods in the US, just foods. So when you think about quality, you can go with USDA organic frozens because not only do you have less chemicals that you're adding into your body, but nutritionally, they have an enormous amount of nutrition because they're typically flash frozen. They're picked and frozen right away. and sent to the store. And so because of that, and because our food system is actually not as great as we'd like to believe, and it, produce that's fresh, that's picked, that's not frozen, kind of travels long distances, maybe weeks, months, or even temperature down to, 6 months before, the nutrient value drops. And when the nutrient value drops, you don't have that additional benefit of the work you're doing. So I like people to think about, number one, buying USDA organic wherever it's accessible. From a cost perspective, looking at frozen USDA organics. And then you can always wash or rinse and agitate regular produce that's not organic that you have access to. In baking soda, 1 part baking soda, maybe 3 or 4 parts water, or white vinegar is great to have next to the sink, because that helps reduce some of the residues that are on that produce as well. So lots of options. There's even the Dirty Dozen Clean 15 list from Environmental Working Group. So I want people to have lots of options, but thinking about food quality and not just the big picture macros like fats and carbs and this and that. It's just a different layer, and it really does change your gut microbiome effects, and it changes the chemistry of your body a little bit more than if you don't think about that.
Got it. Awesome. So are there any specific foods or nutrients that we should be targeting?
So now is that portion of this where, we now know there are incredible studies showing certain nutritional components of food actually offset some of the harm from environmental chemical exposures, that DNA methylation, that sort of genetic, epigenetic changes. We know that, B9 vitamins, which is folic acid, green leafy vegetables, can do that. We know that omega-3 fatty acids from small fish over big fish, because small fish have fewer environmental chemicals than the big fish that chop up the little, chew up the little ones. That's called bioaccumulation. Aim for small fish, sardines, salmon, mackerel, herring. So omegas from fish, omegas from plants. We get flax seeds have omegas that convert properly in a lot of people. So thinking about the omegas can offset that. Thinking about quercetin and vitamin C and vitamin E, these are antioxidants that offset some of the inflammatory response to these exposures that we're experiencing. What else? There's so many when it comes to selenium. Having a diet that has selenium, or as I talk about, in terms of supplements, actual supplements like a multivitamin that has selenium, that actually offsets heavy metals, particularly mercury. So there's nutrients that our body craves that actually has this added value of offsetting chemical exposure harm. And whether you get it from your diet or you get it routinely or not, that's one of the reasons why I recommend a really solid multivitamin amongst other 4 of my human fertilizer recommendations. But since we're talking about it, I think it's worth mentioning that a multivitamin can really give you what you need if you're not able to get consistently some of these really, reasonable nutrients.
Awesome. All right. So what else can people expect when they pick up a copy of Detoxify?
Well, I hope they will tiptoe into, understanding how to go about this process in a way that doesn't freak them out and really walks them through. There's a 21-day plan at the end of the book, which I think really takes what you've read, what you've picked up in the beginning chapters, and really puts it into good form. Like day 1, do this. Day 2, do this. You don't need a lot of thinking. It's just like makes sense. Do 1, day 2, day 3. 21 days gets a good start on this big topic. There is a symptom tracker. So you can actually write down your symptoms at the beginning of, working through the book, and then kind of making your way through 21 days. You can start to see whether your symptoms, fatigue, rashes, abdominal pain, all of these things can really change if you just give your body what it needs. There's a food pyramid, a Detoxify food pyramid, which is really talking about what we should be thinking most at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of food packaging and how to think about food packaging, food cookware, detoxification, water quality, before we even get into the food. So I want that whole picture, something that people might, harness and make some changes. But I hope people just, really embrace it as a way to get started, and look at this as, hand-holding through a very difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah. where can people pick up a copy?
Online, certainly Amazon, Barnes & Noble. But you can go to The Smart Human, which is my website, thesmarthuman.com. I also have courses there, actually, and people can take courses on pesticides and EMF, cellular radiation and what to think about and water quality. But that's the landing page for my educational work is thesmarthuman.com. And my handles on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, podcast are all The Smart Human. The
Smart Human. I love it.
The Smart Human.
I love it. Detoxify, pick up a copy now, everywhere books are available. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for persevering through your own challenges and figuring things out. Because again, we talked about this earlier. A lot of times, some of the most difficult things, it triggers us. It inspires us to open up a whole new layer of service. And you're doing this for us and making this message hit differently and in a much bigger way, because this is something that we can't escape. Our world has changed dramatically, and we need to equip ourselves to be more resilient. And that's what this is all about. So
for sure. And thank you for having me, because it takes a village. So you recognize the power of this work, and I appreciate you bringing me in.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
It depends on what you're using your aluminum foil for, right? So studies show that if it's wrapped around meat or anything acidic, all of that increases the leaching of aluminum into your food. They've shown that the content of aluminum in food wrapped in aluminum foil can be up to 40 times higher than food not wrapped in aluminum.